look, it's private provision of a public good. And the reason I say that is because everybody benefits from education. Do we have the capacity in the state sector for 10 to 15% of students to leave the private sector to go into the state sector? The answer is we don't.
You could say that we all benefit from the fact that all the adults in the IEA office are able to wear clothes. I think our productivity would be dramatically reduced.
Would you be pro lifting the VAT on tampons?
Well, the interesting thing about that...
Hello and welcome to the IEA YouTube channel. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Officer and Linda Wetson Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has announced that he would implement a VAT on private schools if he was to be elected as Prime Minister on the 4th of July. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by two wonks that are going to argue opposite sides of this debate. I have Max Marlow, who is the Director of Research at the Adam Smith Institute, and the Managing Editor at the IEA, Daniel Freeman. So Max, to start with you, do you think that schools should be VAT exempt?
Thank you, Reem. I do think they should be VAT exempt for the primary reason that I think if you take away the kind of role of the state from education, then you should be incentivized to do so. It lowers costs for taxpayers. Indeed, private schools do make money for the state. We can't forget that for a moment. I think it's good to have, a competition with the state for the provision of service, whether that's healthcare, whether that is, of course, security features like, putting a lock on your door, for example, so the police have to keep going over. But most importantly, for public goods, such as education. And I think children should be at the centre of this debate. I don't think messing around with education, stopping kids from going to school is not a good thing.
Okay, so Max is saying that it's a public good, so it should be VAT exempt. Dan, why do you disagree?
Well, I should probably start out by saying I'm not against private schools and I'm not against private education. I've worked in the industry before and I have absolutely no objection if people want to send their children there. The question here is not whether private schools are good or bad, but whether they should be tax exempt. And I think there are lots of things that are good things, some things that have positive externalities, which are still subject to VAT. So, for example, pubs. I think pubs are great.
I also like the pub.
Yeah, this video would not be occurring had we not all been at the pub yesterday. Certainly a positive externality, but I don't think you should exempt pubs from having to pay VAT. I don't think you should, I like ice cream. I don't think you should exempt that from VAT. I like adults wearing clothes, but that is also subject to VAT, as is shower gel. These are all things that are good, or at least morally unobjectionable, but they are subject to VAT. And the problem with Britain's tax system is that it is currently far too complex. We have far too many carve-outs for various areas from VAT. And I would like us to move to a far broader based system where you apply VAT to basically everything, and then use that money raised to cut the rate or cut some of the other more pernicious taxes that we face.
What's really interesting about this debate, I think, is that it sort of speaks to the wider conversation about VAT exemption. And many people will argue that particular goods should be exempt from VAT, including there's been a huge campaign against the tampon tax to make tampons VAT exempt. And I think what's really interesting about that is this conversation about whether or not those distortions in the market are okay and actually those things are moral. And Max, you're making the case that is the case because it is a public good. Now, can you tell me, first of all, what is a public good and why does education fall into that category?
Absolutely. So, it's private provision of a public good. And the reason I say that is because everybody benefits from education. There's a reason we don't put that on books, for example. We like to live in a society where everyone can use the information they acquire to go out and improve things. So I think, when we look at who goes to private school, people always say the old, Eton, Winchester, Harrow, Ampleforth, you name it, right? Really big schools that produce unpopular politicians. And that's a lot of the lead towards, raising this tax. The problem is, though, is that also, a lot of these schools, especially the smaller schools, also produce really good educational outcomes for employees of the future, for employers of the future, of innovators, artists, scientists. It happens in the state sector, it happens in the private sector. So the reason why I would take, umbrage with saying that, public goods such as alcohol, makes us more social. There is a reason why this podcast is happening today. It also has some quite significant negative externalities. And I'm of the belief that, if you want to tax something, you're essentially either purely fundraising or you are using Pigovian principle. So Pigovian principle, that being, you're trying to basically pay for the externality being created. I don't think private schools create negative externalities. I think education is such an important thing for society and the economy at large that we should just be exempting it and making it more affordable for more people to go to private school. And I think fundamentally that's the open and closed case.
So you think that actually the fact that this potentially could have an impact on the number of people that are able to afford to send their children to private schools is also a negative, and that's an additional reason to why it shouldn't be VAT exempt.
Essentially, so the paper I wrote is called exactly. It's called Short-Term Thinking: Analysing the Effects of VAT on Education. And we basically reviewed the case made by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which said that between 3 to 7% of students would leave the sector should VAT be put on, and it would raise in the area of 1.6 billion. We did the numbers on that. We found that not to be the case even with their own migration. So we found it would only raise about 1.03 billion because they don't take into effect wider tax payments such as from payroll, supply, and also they don't take into account kind of the auxiliary of schools, groundskeepers, cleaners, caterers, these sorts of things. So we looked at those numbers. We said it's not going to raise that much money. And then we also thought, well, look, where did that initial migration figure come from? It comes from a study called Dynasky, which looks at private Catholic schools in the US and how migration occurred there. Even Dr. Luke Sibieta, who's the author of the paper, said those were shaky figures. He acknowledges that we don't know what's going to happen if you do apply this tax. So we kind of did a quite broad brochure. We looked at 0% migration all the way up to 30%. And we kind of found, look, if you're at 10 to 15%, you don't make any money. And our thinking is 10 to 15% migration. Now, the problem there, and I will let Daniel interject soon, essentially is that do we have the capacity in the state sector for 10 to 15% of students to leave the private sector to go into the state sector? The answer is we don't. We also don't know where those students will leave. So there are large clusters of private schools in the southeast. There isn't as much capacity there as there is in, let's say, Cheshire East, which has large amounts of capacity. So those very complicated questions are really, really concerning for teachers, for parents both in private and in public and in state schools, and kind of also for the everyday person who, in 10, 15 years' time, is going to inherit an economy where a lot of kids are being pushed out, and we don't know where they'll land.
It's really interesting, I think, from that perspective. Dan, I mean, what do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think that...
Well, I mean, first thing to bring up with this, I'd slightly question what your definition of a public good is here, because traditionally public goods are defined as a good or a service that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Now, education is both. If you have someone going to a school in the private sector, that is excludable. It's excluded on the basis of who can and cannot pay fees, and it's also rivalrous. If I take your place at a private school and there is not an expansion in places, you can't go there. So it's not really what you traditionally call a public good. Now, you might say it has positive externalities, and maybe there are some. I would say the vast majority of the benefit goes to the pupil themselves. Like, that's the reason why people who send their children to private schools are doing it. It's not because of sort of greater benefit overall. But that actually gets to a more fundamental issue that I take with your approach of treating VAT as a kind of Pigovian tax, when there are a few, like, VAT is not meant to be dealing with things that are sinful to consume.
So, for example, like the tax on additional tax on cigarettes, for example.
Yeah. That's totally separate. VAT applies to a whole host of things that are good, morally neutral, or have big benefits to other people. So, for example, you could say that we all benefit from the fact that all the adults in the IEA office are able to wear clothes. I think our productivity would be dramatically reduced if some of us were not wearing clothes. The reason there is VAT on clothes and on a whole range of other products,
Not children's clothes.
that's true. I think you should have VAT on children's clothes.
So, Dad, to be clear about your position, would you impose VAT on everything, all goods?
There are some types of financial services that apparently are quite complicated to do, but I would basically move to a system like they have currently in New Zealand, where you have GST, their equivalent of VAT, which is applied to pretty much all goods and services, including private education, and that would raise huge amounts of revenue. It would dramatically simplify things in terms of administration, both for companies and for the state. And then you could plough those savings back into other tax cuts.
If I can come in on that quickly, Reem, on the GST point, New Zealand also subsidises its private schools. So actually, it's actually revenue neutral, that measure.
I don't think it's entirely revenue.
It's not entirely. It doesn't raise a massive amount. So
as I understand it, the subsidy. Yes, you're absolutely right. That New Zealand does subsidise parents who send their children to private schools, but the subsidy for a secondary school student is 2,000 New Zealand dollars, which is roughly £900. For a primary school student, it's half that. So in order to cancel out the cost of the VAT that they impose on education, it only does that if the fees are less than 6,000 a year, and the average fee in the UK is triple that. So yeah, I actually think if you're concerned about people at sort of dropping off at the very low end, the New Zealand system would be much better, because that extra £900 or that sort of subsidy would help people who would be a big deal if you're in one of the cheaper private schools that's charging $10,000, $12,000 a year. It would be less of a big deal for, the Eatons, the Harrows, the very high end. And you'd be able to restrict it to British students as well.
Just on this point that Max wrote, is that actually there will be so many students that would leave leave independent schools and be forced into state school as a result of not being able to afford it. Do you think that's true? And do you buy it? Max's paper sort of criticises the IFS's report, but what do you think?
Yeah, I am very skeptical about some of the reports we've been seeing of 25% of students are going to leave if you impose VAT. Largely because we've kind of already done this experiment. Private schools have got a lot more expensive, but it's nothing to do with the government. It's because private schools themselves have been increasing the price of their fees. So over the last 10 years, even accounting above inflation, in real terms, private school fees have increased by 25%. Over the last 20 years, they've increased in real terms by 55%. And I'm not criticising the private schools for this. They're acting totally rationally, because they know there is sufficient demand that they can increase these prices, and they won't get a fall in numbers. And they haven't seen this. The proportion of the population of British children that are going to private schools is exactly the same today as it was 20 years ago.
Can I come back on that? So you're right that they've increased those fees at increments. That's the big problem. So what we're interested in here is, what if you increase the price of something by 15% overnight, and then you have to take into account other such factors, such as the case that that's on top of all of those other fee increases. And the reason those fees are going up, it's mainly down to staffing costs. So 73% of all costs for the average school is on staffing, because they're trying to formulate a very healthy labour market. Something that we can tell the reason this policy has come forward is because they want to hire more teachers, because their labour market isn't healthy. So what this VAT exemption has done is engendered a really healthy kind of economy within the education space. I think that's really good. And I think my concern is the absorption of the VAT by those parents who are at the lower end, who can't suddenly fork out another 15% on, let's say, £12,000 worth of fees. And to reinforce that point, we look at Greece, for example. So in about 2015, Greece put 23% general taxation on private schools. The Economist called it total mayhem. A lot of the schools went bust overnight. A lot of teachers left the labour market. There were kids outside of schools literally trying to get in because there was no more space. And then they reversed the policy and things have settled back to normal. It was a catastrophe. And I'm one for learning from real life, empirical evidence. Taxing education, which is not done normally, is actually not allowed by EU rules for this very purpose. So that really is the crux of the issue is, what about the kids, especially those on bursaries, those whose parents are working 2 to 3 jobs to pay for them to get there. How does this affect them overnight? And I think that's really...
I'll let you come back on this then.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm a bit sceptical about how comparable the Greek private education system is to the UK system. I think the UK is able to, has much more demand overall. It's got a much healthier economy. You've got more people at the higher end of the income spectrum who can afford these prices. I'm also very sceptical about the idea that private schools who have increased their fees dramatically, as we said, a lot of this is to increase the number of staff they have, is the assumption seems to be that private schools will immediately just impose a 15% hike rather than cut back on some of the expenses that they've incurred by which they've been able to afford by increasing fees. I think, and you see this actually from a lot of private schools themselves, reassuring parents that even if VAT does come in, we're going to keep the increase, below 10%, below 7%, you get various figures. And so I think it will not all be passed on at once.
To the consumers initially. Well, I suppose that in some ways we don't know what's going to happen. It could be that we're looking at historical trends over the last decade, that there is largely no difference to the number of children in independent schools, or it could be the Greek examples in which it does have a huge impact. I suppose we can't really know until it happens. But I suppose from this perspective, talking about whether or not a public good should be VAT exempt or not, or what we define as a public good, Dan, I mean, you would still be pro keeping a VAT, imposing VAT on public schools, even if there were loads of children that left. So I think we've got to have a sort of conversation about that. Why is it that these things should... I think what's interesting about this, just from this perspective, is that most people would assume that a free marketeer would be anti-imposing VAT on schools, and you're not. And so we'll talk about this. Why is it a distortion in the market? Why is it that... Why shouldn't we have exemptions to VAT?
Well, I think... Actually, the system that we currently have of VAT with a huge number of exemptions on things, we currently have ridiculous examples like a ice cream is susceptible for VAT, but a baked Alaska isn't for some reason. And this creates it's great for tax lawyers. It's great for accountants. It's not good. It's not good for the economy overall. It's not good for.
So you want a simpler tax?
I would want a dramatically simpler, dramatically broader system of VAT. And I think if you're trying to build a coalition for that, it's not really sustainable to say, oh yeah, we should be putting VAT on everything, but not private schools. No, we couldn't possibly do
or not
that.
Tampons. Would you be pro lifting the VAT on tampons?
Well, the interesting thing about that is, tampons did used to have VAT, and then after we left the EU, one of the few sort of significant changes we made was we got rid of we lifted the VAT on that. evidence for that cut actually being passed on to consumers is actually really quite limited. It seems in a lot of cases like the prices basically stayed the same, and manufacturers and supermarkets has pocketed the difference. So I'm fairly skeptical about the sort of merits of cutting VAT on. And the other issue with it is that it forces the government into all of these questions, and it has to start picking winners.
Picking and choosing, there's winners and losers. Max, can you speak to this? I mean, do you think that VAT exemption on some products and some services and on others actually just distorts the market, makes the tax system more complex?
Look, the idea is that, if you, as you've said, Daniel, levy VAT and everything, cut the rates. Do you really trust politicians to start cutting taxes? I don't. Tax burdens increase massively with the highest taxes since the Second World War. I don't see any reason as to why, if we levied it on everything, they'd start cutting. I don't think there's some sort of, invisible hand in their mind which seeks to, cut taxes wherever possible. So that's the first point there. I also think, I agree, Dan, we have an overly complicated tax system. I was at a dinner a couple of weeks ago with a load of tax lawyers, and I was sad.
Sounds riveting.
It was actually really good fun, because I was sat next to the KC who was arguing in favour of carving out large marshmallows. Fascinating. So culinary foods, for example, finished food.
Because it gives them a job.
It gives them a job. Fine. Yeah, I get that. I just think if you want to start making simplification of the tax system, which I'm in favour of, I think starting with children's education is the wrong way to go about it. Let's see how it works in other areas first. So squash the food industry, for example, with that. With that VAT.
Bring back tampon tax.
Look, I'm yet to review the evidence on that. I'm not sure. I'll take Dan's word on that. But the point is, with children's education, it's so important. And I will query, Dan, what you said earlier about, it seems that most of the benefit of education is internalised within the student. How do you say that? Is it because they earn more money afterwards? Well, if they're earning more money, it's because they're being, productive, and they're being, et cetera, et cetera.
I would say it's pretty obvious incentives. People are, I would say, are generally not spending £30,000 a year out of,
as
goodness as that heart. It's
society.
because they believe it does benefit their child directly.
Exactly. And this is why I think education is a public good, because essentially they go out afterwards into the world and they've taken up all these skills, and they've been educated in, some would say, nicer environments, more conducive towards academics or towards especially things like the arts and drama. A great deal of our artists and dramatists and thespians did go to private school. They were trained specifically in those areas. And you see that specialisation afterwards, and it benefits all of us. So that's where I'm really coming from with that.
The same argument comes in with universities. Dan, would you support imposing VAT on university degrees?
Yeah, well, and actually, I would, but one of the interesting things about Max's argument is it's in some ways quite similar to the argument made by people who are against tuition fees.
Yes, that's exactly why.
Oh, yes, of course. It benefits the individual, but we really all benefit from, more educated people. So therefore, the state ought to be.
No, I disagree with that, unfortunately. Look, they wanted to increase the amount of money the state was spending. I'm trying to basically say, no, it's good to have private provision and public provision, and we should encourage more private provision because it saves the taxpayer billions. So, and
I'm very skeptical about.
Well, okay, well, you can look at the numbers released by by Oxford Economics, for example, or even by the Treasury, who say this is actually quite beneficial for our schools to have to have quite a large amount of downstream tax income from these private schools because as the left usually says, because they're businesses. And they're in the business of providing education. That's how the VAT notice is outlined. Same with the universities. Universities are educational businesses. It's why in the same VAT notice, they are also exempt from VAT. I can send it to you afterwards if you wish, Dan. It's very interesting. But it's also foreign language schools, also exempt from VAT. So I think it seems a bit strange that if we want to start levying VAT on private schools, we're not going to do the same to foreign language schools.
You should.
Well, okay, fine.
We should have VAT on basically everything.
Okay, but it's again back to the main point.
Cut the rate.
We can't cut the rate. You've got politicians.
If you extend it to everything, you can cut it dramatically. You could cut it down to about 12%, I
You
think.
could, but will they? Is my biggest.
Okay, well, this is the question about what's politically possible and what is what we would like in an ideal society. So I suppose, Max, ideally, if it was politically possible, if you did think that, if you believed that all politicians were great tax-cutting liberals and would cut the rate if they were able to create a broad base of indirect taxes, would you be pro that?
In utopia, no, I still wouldn't, because no,
It isn't particularly utopian. I mean, you got...
Okay, so look, the main issue I have here is the taxation of education. That's fundamentally, I think it's a bad moral signal to people to say, yes, we're going to now tax the education of children. So fundamentally, I just wouldn't levy tax on education full stop. So no, I would still not be in favour in utopian societies.
Utopian societies. Dan, I'll let you have the last word.
Well, just on that point, in 1979, one of the first things Margaret Thatcher did was jack up VAT and you used the money that was raised by that to cut other far more pernicious taxes. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do, and we should encourage that sort of forward-sightedness in the future.
Well, that's definitely the Thatcher model, isn't it? Increasing indirect taxes and decreasing direct taxes. Max, Dan, thank you very, very much. A very interesting and fiery debate. I'm sure you'll all agree. That was Max Marlow from the Adam Smith Institute and Daniel Freeman from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Two very wonky think tanks. So thank you very, very much for everybody who is watching and listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, if you enjoyed the kind of content that we come out with, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.